Hello, my friend, and welcome to the Sleepy Scholar. Tonight, we are not going to talk about ancient Greece the way a textbook would. We are going to slip quietly into it, into the warm stone streets, the smell of olive oil and wood smoke, the sound of sandals on marble worn soft by centuries of feet. Ancient Greece was not marble statues standing cold and white in museums. It was alive. It was loud and sunlit and human. It was people waking up hungry, falling in love, arguing about politics, and falling asleep under the same stars you'll fall asleep under tonight. You may have had a long day. Your mind might still be humming faintly with everything it carried, tasks, conversations, small worries that don't seem small at 2 in the morning. That's all right. You don't need cosmic mysteries or sheep to count tonight. You just need somewhere gentle to rest your attention while your body does what it already knows how to do. So tonight, we'll wander gently through the daily life of the ancient Greeks, their homes, their meals, their marketplaces, their quiet evenings. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight, and nothing here that you need to hold on to. Just let it drift past you, like light through old olive branches. And if these gentle journeys ever help you rest, a quiet like or subscribe helps other sleepy souls find their way here too. Now, let's settle in. Let your body begin to soften. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, just a little, like something heavy sliding gently off a shelf. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands, wherever they're resting, stop holding on to anything at all. You don't need to remember anything I say tonight. You don't need to follow every thread. Nothing here is a test, and there is no version of tonight where you get it wrong. If your mind wanders off entirely, that's not a failure. That's exactly what it's supposed to do. Let your breathing slow. In gently and out a little longer than the in. Again, if you like. There's no rush. Somewhere far beneath the surface of your thinking mind, your body is already beginning to release the day, the tension in your neck, the tightness behind your eyes, the small alertness that kept you sharp for so many hours. None of that is needed now. So let your mind drift as we begin to wander through an ancient, sunlit world. Ancient Greek homes were built to keep secrets from the street. If you walked down a narrow lane in ancient Athens, you would see almost nothing of how people actually lived. The outer walls facing the street were plain, blank, often just mud brick over a stone foundation, with maybe a single wooden door. There were no windows facing outward at eye level, partly for privacy, partly for safety, partly because glass didn't exist yet, and an open window was just a hole for dust, thieves, and heat. Everything interesting happened facing inward, toward a central courtyard open to the sky. Inside that courtyard, life unfolded. There might be a small altar to the household gods, a well or cistern for water, chickens wandering underfoot, laundry drying in the sun. The rooms of the house opened onto this courtyard like petals around a center, And it was here, not in some grand facade, that a family's real life took place. Cooking, weaving, children playing, someone quietly repairing a sandal strap in the shade. There's something quietly comforting in that image, a home that looks like nothing from the outside, but holds warmth and light at its center. Perhaps some part of you understands that feeling already. The plainness of a closed door and the softness of what waits behind it. But that is only one small part of the story. The Greek day did not begin with an alarm, but with the sun and the birds. There were no clocks in the way you know them. A wealthy household might have a water clock, a simple device that measured time by how quickly water dripped from one container to another. But for most people, the day began when light crept over the eastern hills and ended when it was too dark to work safely. Roosters, not alarms, announced the morning. The first task of the day was often lighting the hearth fire, which had usually been kept smoldering low overnight rather than started fresh. Fire was precious, and relighting one from nothing was slow, difficult work with flint and kindling. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was modest, often just bread dipped in wine, sometimes with a few olives. The heavier meal of the day came later, in the evening, once the work was done. This rhythm meant most of a person's productive hours happened on a fairly empty stomach, fueled mostly by bread, a little fruit, and whatever momentum the morning light provided. There is something almost peaceful in a day shaped only by light and darkness, rather than by the sharp demands of a clock. Tonight, you don't need to keep any kind of time at all. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The word economy comes from a Greek word that simply meant household management. Oikonomia, the root of our word economy, literally meant the rules and rhythms of running a home. And running a Greek household was, in a very real sense, a small operation. Producing food, spinning wool into cloth, managing enslaved workers if the family had any, preserving olives and grain for the months ahead, and keeping accounts of what came in and what went out. The woman of the house, in most families, was the one who held this operation together, even though she rarely appeared in public life or in the historical record with much of a voice. Weaving, in particular, was almost sacred to Greek domestic life. A loom stood in most homes, and spinning wool into thread, then thread into cloth, was constant, ongoing work. The kind you could pick up and set down between other tasks, done in courtyards or covered porches where the light was good. Cloth made this way clothed the entire family, from simple, everyday tunics to the finer garments worn for festivals. Somewhere in that quiet, repetitive rhythm of thread passing through fingers, hour after hour, there is a kind of stillness, a task that asks for patience rather than urgency, much like the slow unwinding your own mind is doing right now. But that is only one small part of the story. Most ancient Greeks wore essentially the same two pieces of clothing their whole lives. There was no closet full of outfits, no seasonal wardrobe in the way you might imagine. The basic garment for nearly everyone, male or female, rich or poor, was the chiton, a simple rectangle of woven wool or linen, pinned at the shoulders and belted at the waist. That could be as plain or as finely made as your household could afford. Over this, in colder weather or for more formal occasions, people wore a haemation, a larger rectangular cloak draped and wrapped around the body, sometimes covering the head as well. What changed was not the shape of the clothing, but the material, the dye, and the craftsmanship. A wealthy family's chiton might be woven from fine linen imported from Egypt, dyed with expensive purple from crushed sea snails, and bordered with intricate patterns. A poorer family's version would be coarse, undyed wool, patched and repatched over years of wear. The garment stayed the same idea. It was the quality that told you everything about who was wearing it. There is something oddly restful in that simplicity, not needing to choose between many options. Just one familiar shape, worn and reworn, softened by time and use. Much like a favorite blanket becomes softer the more nights it wraps around you. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The ancient Greek diet was built almost entirely around three things: bread, wine, and olive oil. These were called the Mediterranean triad, and together they formed the backbone of nearly every meal in nearly every household for centuries. Bread was made from wheat or barley, ground by hand with heavy stone querns, a slow, laborious process usually done by women or enslaved workers each day. Since flour didn't keep well and stale bread was a fact of life. Wine was almost always diluted with water before drinking. Drinking it undiluted was considered a sign of poor manners, or even barbarism, something associated with foreigners rather than civilized Greeks. And olive oil touched nearly everything: cooking, lamp fuel, skin care, even athletic training, where wrestlers rubbed it into their skin before competing. Meat was a luxury for most people, eaten mainly during religious festivals when animals were sacrificed, and the meat afterward was shared among the community. A typical day's food for an ordinary family might be bread, olives, a little cheese, perhaps some fish if they lived near the coast, and vegetables like onions, lentils, or beans, all softened by a drizzle of that same golden oil. Imagine, for a moment, the smell of bread baking and oil warming in a clay pan, a smell that has barely changed in 3,000 years, still rising from kitchens today, still meaning the same thing it always has. Someone is making a meal, and soon there will be rest. But that is only one small part of the story. The ancient Greek symposium was not really about the wine. It was about conversation, poetry, and permission to be human together. A symposium was a private drinking party, usually held after dinner, exclusively for men, though hired musicians, dancers, or companions might also attend. Guests reclined on couches arranged around the edges of a room, propped on one elbow, and a symposiarch, or master of the party, was chosen to decide how strong the wine would be diluted and how the evening's activities would unfold. This wasn't chaotic drinking, it was structured, almost ritualized socializing, with games, riddles, songs, and philosophical debate woven between rounds of wine. One popular game was Katabos, where guests flicked the last few drops of wine from their cups at a target across the room, trying to knock over a small disc balanced on a stand. A strange, playful skill practiced by grown men after a full day of politics or business. Poetry was often recited or even composed on the spot. Verse passed from guest to guest as the wine flowed, each person expected to add a line. There is something tender in imagining grown men, after all their public duties and posturing were set aside for the day, lying back on cushions, half-focused, trading verses and gentle jokes in low candlelight, much like your own mind right now, drifting loosely between thoughts, in no hurry to land anywhere in particular. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Greek women's lives were, for the most part, lived indoors and largely unrecorded by history. In classical Athens, especially, respectable women were expected to spend most of their time within the home, managing the household, weaving, raising children, and rarely appearing in public without a specific reason. A religious festival, a family funeral, perhaps fetching water at a public fountain, which doubled as one of the few places women could gather and talk freely with each other. This wasn't universal across all of Greece. Women in Sparta, notably, had far more freedom, owned property, and were expected to be physically strong and outspoken. But in Athens, the ideal was for a woman to be, as one ancient writer put it, so unremarkable that no one spoke of her at all, for good or ill. Because of this, we know astonishingly little about the inner lives of most ancient Greek women. Their private thoughts, friendships, humor, and small daily joys are almost entirely missing from the historical record, which was written almost exclusively by and about men. What we do know comes from pottery paintings showing women weaving or playing music together, from grave inscriptions honoring mothers and wives, and from the occasional surviving letter or poem. There is a quiet kind of sadness in a life so thoroughly private that history barely noticed it. And also, perhaps, something gentle in imagining those small, unrecorded moments. Women laughing together at a fountain, a private joke, unwitnessed and unbothered by the weight of history. But that is only one small part of the story. Athenian democracy did not include the vast majority of people living in Athens. When we say Athens invented democracy, it's worth pausing on who exactly that word included. To vote, hold office, or speak in the assembly, you had to be a free, adult male citizen, meaning your father was also an Athenian citizen. This excluded women entirely, excluded the thousands of enslaved people who made up perhaps a third of the population, and excluded medics, free foreigners who lived and worked in Athens, sometimes for generations, paid taxes, and even served in the military, yet never gained citizenship rights. Of the roughly 250,000 people living in Athens and its surrounding region at its height, only around 30 or 40,000 were citizens eligible to participate. And of those, only a fraction attended the assembly on any given day. The word democracy itself comes from demos, meaning the people, but in practice, the people was a narrower circle than the word suggests today. It's a gentle reminder that even our oldest, most celebrated ideas were imperfect, built by flawed humans doing their best with the ideas available to them. Not so different, perhaps, from any of us doing our best with what we understand today. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Greek children played with toys remarkably similar to ones you might recognize. Archaeologists have found ancient Greek yo-yos made of terracotta or wood, with painted designs on each side. Children rolled hoops down streets with a stick, spun tops, played with dolls made of clay or cloth with movable limbs, and kicked around inflated animal bladders in early versions of ball games. There was even a version of jacks, played with the small knuckle bones of sheep or goats, called astrogale, used both as toys and, later in life, as simple dice for gambling games among adults. Girls, in particular, had a poignant custom. On the eve of marriage, it was traditional to dedicate their childhood toys and dolls to a goddess, usually Artemis, as a symbolic farewell to childhood before stepping into the responsibilities of adult womanhood. Archaeologists have found small clay dolls left as offerings at ancient shrines, presumably placed there by young brides marking that quiet threshold. There's something tender in that idea, setting down the toys of childhood not with sadness, but as an offering, a gentle closing of one chapter before opening another. Perhaps tonight, you can set down today the same way, not discarded, just gently placed aside. But that is only one small part of the story. The ancient Olympics were part athletic competition, part religious festival, and entirely male in participation. Held every 4 years at Olympia in honor of Zeus, the games included events like the stadium sprint, wrestling, boxing, the pentathlon, and chariot racing. Athletes competed completely nude, a practice the Greeks associated with an ideal of the human body as something to be displayed with pride rather than modesty. Married women were forbidden from even attending as spectators, on penalty of death, according to some ancient sources, though unmarried girls could watch, and women could still win in some events, since chariot race winners were technically the owners of the horses, not the drivers themselves. Winners received no cash prize, only a wreath woven from wild olive branches cut from a sacred tree near the temple of Zeus. But the real reward came afterward. Olympic victors returned home to extraordinary honors, free meals for life, prominent seating at public events, sometimes even statues built in their likeness, and poems composed specifically to celebrate their victory, meant to be sung for generations. There's something almost sweet in a prize made not of gold, but of leaves, a reminder that the things we build our lives around chasing are so often symbolic, and that real rest, real honor, often comes quietly afterward at home. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Greek theater began as a religious ritual and slowly became something closer to what we'd recognize as entertainment. The earliest Greek plays were performed at festivals honoring Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry, and were originally closer to hymns sung by a chorus than to stories with individual characters. Over time, playwrights began introducing actors who could speak individual lines and interact with the chorus, gradually building toward the tragedies and comedies we still study today. Works by Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes. All roles, including female characters, were played by men, wearing large expressive masks that helped the audience, sometimes as many as 15 or 20,000 people, seated in enormous open-air theaters, see basic emotional expressions from far away. These theaters were remarkable feats of acoustic engineering, built into hillsides so that a performer's unamplified voice could carry clearly to the very back rows. A design so effective that some ancient Greek theaters, thousands of years later, still demonstrate this acoustic clarity when tested by modern engineers standing at their centers. There's a quiet wonder in that, a whisper, carried gently and clearly across thousands of listeners, without any machinery at all, just the careful shape of stone and hillside. Perhaps your own thoughts tonight can travel just as gently, carried softly toward sleep, without needing any effort to push them there. But that is only one small part of the story. Ancient Greek medicine slowly separated the idea of illness from the idea of divine punishment. For much of early Greek history, sickness was understood as the result of angering a god or being cursed, and healing was sought through prayer, sacrifice, and visits to healing sanctuaries like the one dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine. But around the 5th century BCE, a physician named Hippocrates and his followers began proposing something radically different, that illness had natural physical causes rooted in the body itself, particularly in a theory of 4 bodily fluids or humors whose balance determined health. The Hippocratic tradition emphasized careful observation of patients, tracking symptoms, diet, environment, even the color of urine, rather than relying purely on ritual. Physicians following this tradition took an oath promising to do no harm and to keep patient information confidential, an oath so influential that modern doctors still take a version of it today, over 2,000 years later. There's something comforting in that continuity, a quiet promise whispered by healers across thousands of years that someone is watching carefully over you, trying gently to understand what your body needs without judgment. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Slavery was woven so deeply into ancient Greek life that even democracy depended on it. It's uncomfortable, but important to sit with honestly. A significant portion of the population in most Greek city-states, historians estimate perhaps a third of people in Athens at its height, were enslaved. Some were prisoners of war. Some were purchased from foreign traders. Some were born into slavery. Enslaved people worked in homes, in silver mines under brutal conditions, on farms, and as skilled craftsmen. Some, particularly those with specialized skills, lived relatively stable lives and could occasionally earn or be granted freedom, while others, especially in the mines, faced conditions so severe that life expectancy there was extremely short. The very system of Athenian democracy, free male citizens having the leisure time to attend lengthy assembly meetings, debate philosophy, and pursue civic life, was made possible in large part by enslaved labor handling the physical work of the household and economy. It's a difficult truth sitting quietly beneath the shining ideas we've inherited from this era. Extraordinary philosophy and brutal injustice existing side by side in the same society. We don't need to resolve that discomfort tonight. It's simply true, the way many things about history are simply, quietly true, layered, imperfect, worth remembering honestly rather than forgetting for comfort. But that is only one small part of the story. The Greek alphabet was adapted from the Phoenicians, and it changed something fundamental about who could access knowledge. Before the Greeks adopted and modified the Phoenician writing system around the 8th century BCE, most writing systems in the ancient world, like Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform, required years of specialized training to read and write, usually reserved for professional scribes. The Greek innovation was adding vowel symbols, something Phoenician script lacked, which made the system far simpler and more learnable. This small technical change had enormous consequences. Literacy, while still far from universal, spread more widely through Greek society than in almost any earlier civilization, reaching merchants, craftsmen, and eventually even some enslaved people and women, alongside the traditional educated elite. This wider access to writing helped make possible the explosion of Greek philosophy, drama, history, and science that followed ideas could be written down, copied, circulated, and debated by more people than ever before, rather than staying locked inside a small scribal class. There's something quietly moving in that, a small adjustment, a handful of added symbols, quietly opening a door that had been shut for most of human history. Sometimes the smallest changes ripple outward the furthest, like a single dropped pebble spreading slow circles across still water. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The Greeks believed illness of the mind and body were deeply connected to dreams, and built entire sanctuaries around the practice of dream healing. At healing sanctuaries dedicated to Asclepius, sick pilgrims would undergo a ritual called incubation, sleeping overnight within the temple grounds in a specially designated hall, in hopes that the god would visit them in a dream and either heal them directly or reveal the proper treatment. Priests would then help interpret these dreams the next morning, translating symbolic dream imagery into practical medical advice. Non-venomous snakes were kept at these sanctuaries and allowed to move freely among the sleeping patients, since snakes were sacred to Asclepius, and their presence was considered part of the healing atmosphere rather than something frightening. Archaeological remains of these sanctuaries, particularly the famous one at Epidaurus, include hundreds of inscribed tablets recording patients' names, their ailments, and the dreams or cures they experienced there. An ancient, stone-carved record of people just like you, lying down in a quiet, sacred place, hoping simply to be healed while they slept. There's something oddly touching in that image. Across all these centuries, humans gathering in a quiet hall, trusting that sleep itself might be part of the medicine, that healing could happen simply by lying still and letting go. But that is only one small part of the story. Greek city-states were fiercely independent, and many Greeks felt more loyalty to their city than to any shared idea of Greece. There was no single unified Greek nation in the ancient world. Instead, hundreds of independent city-states, called polis, each with its own government, laws, currency, calendar, and often its own dialect of the Greek language. Athens and Sparta, the two most famous, were bitter rivals with almost opposite values. Athens prized art, philosophy, and democratic debate, while Sparta prized military discipline, austerity, and unquestioning obedience to the state. These two cities fought a long, exhausting war against each other, the Peloponnesian War, that lasted decades and ultimately weakened both. What united Greeks culturally, more than any political structure, was a shared language, shared gods, shared festivals like the Olympics, and a shared sense of being distinct from barbarians, a word the Greeks used simply to describe non-Greek speakers, whose languages sounded to Greek ears like meaningless babbling, bar bar bar. There's something worth resting on in that fierce, fragmented independence. Hundreds of small worlds, each certain of its own way of living, each convinced its values were the right ones, coexisting uneasily under one shared sky and one shared language. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Spartan boys were taken from their families at age 7 to begin a brutal, state-run education designed entirely around producing soldiers. This system, called the agoge, removed boys from their homes and placed them into group barracks where they were deliberately underfed, encouraged to steal food without getting caught as a lesson in cunning and self-reliance, and subjected to intense physical training, harsh discipline, and communal living, designed to erase individual identity in favor of loyalty to the state and to each other. Spartan girls, unusually for the ancient world, also received formal physical education, wrestling, running, javelin throwing, based on the belief that strong mothers produced strong soldiers. The goal of this entire system was to produce citizens for whom personal comfort, individual ambition, and even family attachment were secondary to absolute loyalty to Sparta itself. It was, by most accounts, including some ancient Greek ones, an extraordinarily harsh way to raise a child. And yet, it produced one of the most feared and disciplined military forces in the ancient world. There's a certain heaviness in that history, worth simply noticing rather than resolving. A whole society organized around discipline so total that softness itself was treated as a weakness to be trained away. Tonight, at least, softness is exactly what's welcome. But that is only one small part of the story. The ancient Greeks navigated the Mediterranean using the stars, coastal landmarks, and an intimate, inherited knowledge of wind patterns. There were no compasses in ancient Greece. Magnetic compasses wouldn't reach the Mediterranean world for well over 1,000 years. Instead, Greek sailors relied on careful, memorized knowledge passed down through generations. Which star to follow at night, how the coastline looked from a distance, which winds blew reliably in which season, and where dangerous currents or rocks lay hidden beneath the surface. Long sea voyages were largely avoided during winter months, when storms made navigation without modern instruments extremely dangerous, and most sailing activity clustered into a safer sailing season roughly from late spring through early autumn. Trading ships, wider and slower than the sleek warships called triremes, carried olive oil, wine, pottery, and grain across the Mediterranean and Black Sea, connecting Greek city-states to distant colonies and trading partners in Egypt, the Near East, and even as far as the western Mediterranean coasts of what is now France and Spain. There's something quietly beautiful in that image, sailors, generation after generation, learning to read the sky and see the way you might read a familiar face, trusting patterns passed down by people who came before them. Patterns solid enough to guide a small wooden ship safely across a vast, dark expanse of open water. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Greek pottery was never just functional. It was also, unintentionally, one of the greatest archives of daily life ever preserved. Because clay pottery survives for thousands of years, while wood, cloth, and papyrus mostly decay, much of what we know about ancient Greek daily life comes from painted scenes on vases, cups, and storage jars. Artists painted scenes of children playing, women weaving, athletes competing, soldiers arming for battle, symposium parties, wedding processions, and religious rituals. An enormous, accidental visual record of ordinary moments that the Greeks themselves likely never imagined would become historically significant. Different regions developed distinctive styles. The black figure technique, where dark silhouetted figures were painted onto the natural orange clay, gave way over time to red figure pottery, where the background was painted black, and the figures were left in the natural red-orange color of the clay, allowing for much finer, more expressive detail in faces and drapery. There's something quietly moving in that accident of preservation, that the most ordinary, unremarkable moments of daily life, painted almost casually onto cups and jars, ended up traveling further through time than the great palaces and temples ever could, simply because clay, once fired, refuses to fully disappear. But that is only one small part of the story. The ancient Greek concept of hospitality, called xenia, was considered a sacred obligation enforced by the gods themselves. Under xenia, a host was expected to provide food, shelter, and protection to any traveler who arrived at their door. No questions asked, before even learning the guest's name or purpose. And in turn, the guest was expected to behave respectfully and not overstay their welcome or take advantage of their host's generosity. This wasn't just polite custom. It was considered sacred, protected directly by Zeus in his role as Zeus Xenios, Zeus of strangers, and violating Xenia, either as a rude guest or an inhospitable host, was believed to invite divine punishment. This concept appears throughout Greek mythology and literature, most famously in the Odyssey, where numerous episodes hinge on characters either honoring or violently betraying the rules of hospitality, with betrayal typically leading to disaster. In a world without hotels, reliable maps, or safe travel infrastructure, this shared cultural expectation of hospitality functioned as a kind of social safety net for anyone far from home. There's something quietly comforting in that old idea that a stranger arriving tired and far from home was owed warmth, food, and shelter simply by virtue of needing it. No explanation required. Wherever you are resting tonight, may it feel exactly that safe. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Greek philosophers didn't just think about ideas in the abstract. They argued in public, in the open air, surrounded by ordinary city life. Philosophers like Socrates didn't lecture from behind podiums in quiet halls. They wandered through the Agora, the bustling central marketplace of Athens, stopping ordinary citizens, merchants, craftsmen, young men, anyone willing to engage, and drawing them into long, probing conversations, questioning their assumptions about justice, virtue, knowledge, and the good life. This method, later called the Socratic method, involved asking a series of patient, often uncomfortable questions designed to expose contradictions in a person's beliefs, not to embarrass them, but to help them think more clearly. Socrates himself never wrote anything down. Everything we know of his teachings comes through the writings of his students, particularly Plato, who recorded these marketplace conversations as dialogues. Socrates was eventually put on trial and executed by the city of Athens, accused of corrupting the youth and impiety toward the gods. A philosopher, ultimately undone by the same public city life that had given his ideas a stage. There's something quietly striking in imagining philosophy, not as something confined to books, but as something that happened in the noise and bustle of everyday commerce, profound questions about how to live a good life, asked casually between purchases of bread and olive oil in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. But that is only one small part of the story. The Greek agora was not just a marketplace. It was the true center of civic, social, and economic life in any Greek city. Far more than a place to buy goods, the agora functioned as a public square where citizens gathered daily to socialize, conduct business, hear public announcements, watch legal proceedings, and simply pass time. Surrounded by covered colonnades called stoas, which provided shade from the sun and shelter from rain. The Agora housed shops, banking activities. Moneylenders sat at tables doing currency exchange and loans, as well as public buildings related to government administration. For many Greek men, especially in Athens, a visit to the Agora was a daily ritual, not unlike checking in on the world each morning. A chance to hear news, gossip, debate politics, watch a philosopher holding court, or simply see and be seen by fellow citizens. Women and enslaved people also moved through this space, buying and selling goods, though respectable women's presence there was typically brief and purposeful rather than social. There's something familiar in that daily gathering ritual. Humans, across thousands of years, still drawn to the same basic need: to step outside, hear what's happening, exchange a few words with familiar faces, and feel, if only briefly, connected to the wider rhythm of a shared community. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Ancient Greek marriage was, for most women, arranged and typically happened at a strikingly young age. Athenian girls were commonly married around 14 to 16 years old, often to men considerably older, in matches arranged by their fathers, primarily for economic or political advantage between families rather than romantic affection. The bride typically moved from her father's household directly into her husband's, sometimes into a household run by her mother-in-law. A transition that could be lonely and disorienting for a very young woman leaving behind her childhood home, and likely most of her prior social connections. Wedding ceremonies involved several symbolic stages spread across days. A ritual bath using water carried from a special spring, a wedding feast at the bride's family home, and finally, a torchlit procession at night carrying the bride to her new husband's house. Often depicted on surviving pottery as a lively, communal celebration involving music, dancing, and well-wishing neighbors lining the streets. There's a certain tenderness worth sitting within that image. A very young woman walking by torchlight through unfamiliar streets toward an unfamiliar home, surrounded by noise and celebration, carrying quietly, perhaps, her own private uncertainty beneath the public joy. But that is only one small part of the story. Greek funerals followed careful, ritualized stages designed to honor the dead and protect the living from spiritual harm. The process began with the prothesis, where the body was washed, anointed with oil, dressed in fine clothing, and laid out on a bed within the home for family and community members to visit, mourn, and pay respects. Often for a full day, allowing time for lamentation, a formalized, sometimes musical style of public grieving, particularly practiced by women, involving rhythmic wailing and ritual gestures of sorrow. This was followed by the ekphora, a procession, usually held very early in the morning before sunrise, carrying the body to its burial or cremation site outside the city walls. Greeks believed strongly in proper burial as essential for the soul's peaceful passage into the afterlife. A body left unburied was thought to result in a restless, wandering spirit, unable to cross into the realm of the dead. This belief was so powerful that leaving an enemy's body unburied was considered one of the cruelest possible acts, a theme that appears repeatedly in Greek tragedy and mythology. There's something quietly moving in that ancient insistence that every person, however humble, deserved careful hands to wash them, careful cloth to dress them, and a careful procession to lay them finally to rest. A final act of tenderness extended even into death. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Greek doctors and midwives understood remarkably detailed, if sometimes mistaken, ideas about childbirth and women's health. The Hippocratic medical texts include extensive writings specifically on gynecology and childbirth, describing techniques for assisting difficult births, herbal remedies believed to ease labor, and detailed, though not always medically accurate, theories about female anatomy and reproduction. Midwives, almost always women themselves, were the primary attendants at childbirth, since male physicians rarely, if ever, were present for the birth itself, though they might be consulted for complications. Childbirth was genuinely dangerous in the ancient world, with significant risk to both mother and child. And this danger was reflected in Greek religious practice. Women who died in childbirth were sometimes honored with funerary monuments similar to those given to soldiers who died in battle, an implicit acknowledgement that childbirth, too, was a kind of dangerous, honorable service to the community. There's something quietly powerful in that parallel. A mother's ordinary, private act of bringing new life into the world, understood by an ancient society as carrying a bravery worth the same solemn honor as a soldier's sacrifice. But that is only one small part of the story. Greek education for boys emphasized memorization, music, and physical fitness in roughly equal measure. A typical Athenian boy from a family that could afford it began formal schooling around age 7, learning to read and write using wax tablets and a stylus for practice. Since papyrus was expensive and reserved mainly for more permanent, formal documents, a significant portion of education involved memorizing long passages of poetry, especially Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, both for their literary value and because they were considered essential moral and cultural education, teaching lessons about honor, courage, and the relationship between mortals and gods. Music education, particularly learning to play the lyre and sing, was considered just as important as reading and writing, believed to cultivate harmony and discipline of character. Physical education, meanwhile, took place at a separate facility called the Palestra, a wrestling and athletics school where boys trained in running, wrestling, and other sports considered essential preparation for both civic life and eventual military service. There's something quietly lovely in that balance, mind, voice, and body, all trained together, as though the Greeks understood something we sometimes forget, that a person isn't fully educated by facts alone, but by the fuller, gentler cultivation of many different parts of themselves at once. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The Greeks divided time using a lunar calendar, which meant each city-state's calendar didn't quite match its neighbors. Because the Greek calendar was based on the cycles of the moon rather than the solar year, and because each city-state adjusted and named its months somewhat independently, coordinating dates between different Greek cities for trade, diplomacy, or shared religious festivals could be genuinely confusing. A merchant traveling between Athens and Sparta might find the two cities' calendars several days or even weeks out of alignment with each other. Occasionally, an extra month was inserted into the calendar to keep it roughly synchronized with the solar seasons, a practice called intercalation, though exactly when and how this was done varied from place to place. Time within a single day was divided even more loosely. Sundials existed, but were imprecise and useless at night or on cloudy days, and most people simply organized their day around natural markers: sunrise, midday, sunset, roughly divided further by the position of the sun, or at night, the position of certain stars. There's something almost freeing in imagining a world where time itself was soft and approximate rather than sharply divided into precise minutes, where midday simply meant the sun was roughly overhead and nobody worried much beyond that. Tonight, you don't need to measure anything either. Time can be just as soft and approximate as it was then. But that is only one small part of the story. Greek craftsmen, potters, sculptors, metalworkers occupied a curious middle position in a society that officially valued philosophy and leisure over manual labor. Manual work, in the elite Greek worldview expressed by writers like Aristotle, was often looked down upon as unworthy of a free citizen's higher pursuits. Physical labor was, in this view, something better suited to enslaved people or the lower classes. And yet, the astonishing craftsmanship of Greek pottery, sculpture, and metalwork required years of skilled apprenticeship and genuine artistic mastery. And the finest craftsmen were sometimes celebrated individually, their work signed and prized, their names remembered across centuries, even when we know almost nothing else about them as people. Workshops for pottery and sculpture were often family businesses, passing skills and techniques down from father to son across generations. Clustered together in certain neighborhoods of cities like Athens, where the sound of hammering metal or the smell of a kiln firing clay would have been a constant, familiar backdrop to daily life. There's something quietly satisfying in imagining those neighborhoods, the rhythmic sounds of careful, repetitive craft, hands shaping clay or metal into something lasting, hour after unhurried hour, a kind of steady, working meditation, indifferent to the philosophical arguments happening elsewhere about whether such work was worthy of respect. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The famous white marble of Greek statues and temples wasn't actually meant to look white at all. Nearly every Greek marble statue and temple that survives today has lost its original surface. Over the centuries, wind, rain, and time stripped away layer after layer of paint, leaving only the bare white stone underneath, which is how we've come to imagine classical Greek art: pale, austere, colorless. But the Greeks themselves painted their statues and temples in vivid, sometimes startlingly bright colors: deep blues, reds, golds, and detailed patterns on clothing, hair, and even eyes, made to look as lifelike and vibrant as possible, rather than austere and marble pale. Modern researchers, using specialized ultraviolet imaging techniques, have been able to detect faint traces of these original pigments still clinging to ancient statues and temple friezes, allowing artists to reconstruct, with reasonable accuracy, just how colorful these monuments once were, a discovery that surprised. And for some, even disappointed people who had grown attached to the serene, colorless image of classical antiquity. There's something quietly poignant in that loss. An entire civilization's most beloved artworks, worn slowly pale by time, until we mistook the absence of color for the original intention, forgetting that they were once as vivid and alive as anything painted today. But that is only one small part of the story. The Greeks had no unified currency. Each city-state minted its own coins, often stamped with a symbol representing that city's particular identity. Athens minted silver coins called drachmas, famously stamped with an owl, the symbol of Athena, goddess of the city. Other city-states used their own symbols: a turtle for Aegina, a rose for Rhodes, a winged horse for Corinth. Each coin instantly recognizable to Greeks familiar with the different city-states' emblems, even without being able to read the accompanying inscriptions. Athenian owl coins, in particular, became so trusted and widely circulated throughout the ancient Mediterranean due to Athens's access to a particularly rich silver mine at Laurion. that they functioned almost like an early international reserve currency, accepted well beyond Athens's own borders. Trade between cities using different currencies required money changers who sat in the agora calculating exchange rates and taking a small fee. An early, informal version of the currency exchange services still found in airports and border towns today. There's something quietly charming in imagining coins passing hand to hand across the ancient Mediterranean, each one a tiny, portable symbol of home, carrying a little owl or turtle or rose across vast distances, changing hands in cities its minters never imagined it would reach. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Ancient Greek bathing customs were communal, and public bathhouses became important social gathering spaces, particularly for men. While wealthier homes might have private bathing facilities, usually just a basin and a servant to pour water. Since indoor plumbing, as you'd recognize, it didn't exist. Most people used public bathhouses, which by the later classical period had become quite sophisticated, sometimes including heated pools, changing rooms, and spaces for socializing before or after bathing. These bathhouses often connected directly to the gymnasium, the space for athletic training and exercise, since bathing was considered a natural extension of physical exercise, washing away the oil and dust that athletes used and accumulated during training. Soap in the form you'd recognize didn't exist. Instead, people used olive oil, applying it to the skin, and then scraping it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil, taking the day's dirt and sweat along with it. A practice so central to Greek hygiene that strigils appear frequently among archaeological finds and in painted pottery scenes. There's something quietly satisfying in that ritual, oil applied, then carefully scraped away, dust and effort of the day drawn off the skin in slow, deliberate strokes, leaving behind something clean and unburdened, much like your own mind, slowly scraping away the residue of today. But that is only one small part of the story. Greek religion had no single sacred text and no central religious authority. Belief and practice varied significantly from city to city, and even household to household. Unlike religions built around a single scripture, Greek religious practice was based on shared mythology, inherited ritual, and local tradition, meaning that while most Greeks recognized the same broad pantheon of gods, Zeus, Athena, Apollo, Poseidon, and many others, the specific rituals, festivals, and even which gods received the most devoted local worship varied considerably between regions. A city might have a particular patron deity, like Athena for Athens, worshipped with special devotion and elaborate festivals, while other gods received more modest attention locally, even if they were important elsewhere. Religious practice centered heavily on ritual correctness rather than personal belief or faith in the way many modern religions emphasize. Performing sacrifices, festivals, and prayers in the proper traditional manner was considered essential to maintaining good relations with the gods, regardless of a person's private inner convictions. Household worship, centered around a small altar to Hestia, goddess of the hearth, happened daily and quietly, woven into the ordinary rhythm of domestic life rather than confined to grand temples. There's something oddly comforting in that flexibility. A religious world built more around shared ritual and community practice than rigid, universal doctrine. Each household tending its own small, quiet flame in its own particular way. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Ancient Greek mathematics was pursued largely as pure intellectual inquiry, disconnected in the minds of many philosophers from practical, everyday application. Figures like Pythagoras, Euclid, and later Archimedes developed extraordinarily sophisticated ideas in geometry, number theory, and early calculus-like reasoning, often for reasons that were more philosophical or even spiritual than practical. Pythagoras and his followers, for instance, believed numbers held mystical, almost sacred significance, capable of explaining the fundamental harmony of the universe itself, an idea reflected in their study of musical intervals and mathematical ratios. Euclid's work, compiled in a text called the Elements, systematically laid out geometric proofs with such rigor and clarity that it remained the standard textbook for teaching geometry in schools worldwide for well over 2,000 years afterward. Greek mathematicians worked without the numeral system you're familiar with today. No zero as a placeholder, no simple decimal notation. Instead, using letters of the alphabet to represent numbers. A system that made even basic arithmetic considerably more cumbersome than modern methods, yet didn't stop them from reaching remarkably advanced conclusions through careful geometric reasoning. There's something quietly humbling in that persistence. Extraordinary mathematical insight achieved not through convenient tools, but through patient, careful thought alone, minds working slowly and deliberately toward truths that still hold, unchanged, all these centuries later. But that is only one small part of the story. Greek astronomers made surprisingly accurate observations about the cosmos, working entirely with the naked eye, centuries before the invention of the telescope. Aristarchus of Samos proposed, remarkably early, that the earth revolved around the sun rather than the other way around. A heliocentric idea that was largely rejected by his contemporaries in favor of an Earth-centered model, and wouldn't be widely accepted again until Copernicus revived a similar idea nearly 2,000 years later. Eratosthenes, meanwhile, calculated the circumference of the Earth with startling accuracy, using nothing more than the angle of shadows cast at noon in two different cities and the known distance between them. A simple, elegant piece of geometric reasoning that arrived remarkably close to the planet's actual measurements. These achievements happened without telescopes, without precise timekeeping instruments, relying instead on patient observation, careful record keeping passed down over generations, and confident geometric reasoning applied to what the naked eye alone could see in the night sky. There's something quietly awe-inspiring in that image, ancient minds, lying back perhaps much like you are now, looking up at the same stars, working out through patient thought alone truths about the very shape and scale of the world they lived on. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The Greek military relied heavily on a tightly coordinated infantry formation called the phalanx, which required extraordinary trust between soldiers. In a phalanx formation, heavily armored soldiers called hoplites stood shoulder to shoulder in tight rows, each soldier's large round shield covering not only his own left side, but also protecting the exposed right side of the soldier standing beside him. This meant the formation's strength depended entirely on cohesion and mutual trust. If one soldier broke formation or fled, it could expose his neighbor to danger, potentially collapsing the entire line. Training and social pressure both emphasized this collective responsibility heavily. Abandoning your shield in battle was considered one of the deepest possible disgraces in Greek warrior culture, precisely because it meant abandoning the protection of the men around you. Battles between opposing phalanxes often became brutal, close quarters pushing matches. Armored men pressed together, shields locked, struggling to break the opposing line through sheer collective force and discipline rather than individual heroics. There's something quietly moving in that idea of interdependence, strength coming not from any single person's courage alone, but from an entire line of people, each one trusting the person beside them completely, each one's safety bound up in everyone else's steadiness. But that is only one small part of the story. Ancient Greek gardens were often small, practical spaces rather than the purely decorative gardens you might imagine. Most household gardens, tucked into courtyards or small plots near homes, were focused on growing useful herbs, vegetables, and fruit trees rather than purely ornamental flowers. Though flowers certainly had their place too, particularly roses, violets, and lilies, which were prized for their scent and used in perfumes, religious offerings, and festival decorations. Sacred groves, meanwhile, dedicated to particular gods, were treated with special religious reverence, and cutting down trees within them was often considered a serious offense against the divine. Certain plants carried deep symbolic meaning throughout Greek culture. The olive tree, sacred to Athena, represented peace and prosperity. The laurel, sacred to Apollo, was woven into wreaths for poets and victors, and the myrtle was closely associated with Aphrodite and used in wedding celebrations. There's something quietly lovely in that layered meaning. A simple garden holding not just food for the table, but tiny living symbols of peace, victory, love, and devotion, growing quietly together in modest courtyards, mostly unnoticed except by the people who tended them daily. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Greek athletes trained for years under strict routines, and the gymnasium was as much a place of quiet discipline as of sweat and competition. A gymnasium in ancient Greece was far more than a place to exercise. The word itself comes from gymnos, meaning naked, a reflection of the practice of training unclothed, bodies gleaming with olive oil, moving through wrestling holds, foot races, and javelin throws under open sky. These spaces often included shaded colonnades where philosophers taught between training sessions, libraries where scrolls could be read after a workout, and quiet gardens for walking and conversation, making the gymnasium as much an intellectual gathering place as a physical one. Young men might spend years training for events like the pentathlon, learning discus throwing, long jump, performed with handheld weights called halters to increase distance, javelin, sprinting, and wrestling, all under the guidance of a paedotribes, a professional trainer who studied the body almost the way a physician did. Training itself followed careful, repeated rhythms. The same holds practiced daily, the same distances run, the same throws repeated until the motion became less something the athlete thought about and more something the body simply knew how to do on its own. Muscle memory built slowly across seasons and years. There's something quietly familiar in that kind of repetition. The way emotion, practiced enough times, stops requiring conscious thought at all and becomes simply something the body remembers how to do. The way your own breathing right now has slipped quietly out of your conscious control and into something older and more automatic. But that is only one small part of the story. Greek music relied on instruments and scales quite different from what modern ears are used to, built around modes believed to influence mood and character. The two most common instruments were the lyre, a stringed instrument associated with Apollo and considered dignified, suitable for education and refined gatherings, and the aulos, a double-reeded wind instrument with a more piercing, emotional sound, associated with Dionysus, and used at more ecstatic, less restrained occasions like certain religious rites and theatrical performances. Greek musical theory organized melodies into different modes, patterns of intervals believed to carry distinct emotional and even moral qualities. The Dorian mode was considered noble and steady, suitable for cultivating courage, while the Lydian mode was thought to be softer, more relaxing, even melancholic. Philosophers like Plato took these musical modes seriously enough to argue that certain modes should be restricted in education, worried that the wrong kind of music could subtly corrupt a young person's character over time. An ancient version of concerns about media and mood that still echo today in different forms. There's something soothing in imagining that soft, steady Lydian mode drifting through an ancient courtyard in the evening, deliberately chosen centuries ago for its gentle, calming quality, not so different from the low and unhurried quality of this very voice tonight. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The Greek symposium of ideas extended beyond adult men. Greek boys and girls both absorbed enormous amounts of mythology simply through everyday storytelling, long before any formal schooling began. Long before a child could read, they would have heard myths recited by parents, grandparents, and household nurses. Stories of Heracles and his labors, of Persephone's descent into the underworld each winter, of clever Odysseus outwitting monsters on his long journey home. These stories weren't simply entertainment. They carried practical lessons about courage, hospitality, respect for the gods, and the dangers of pride, embedded so naturally into the fabric of childhood that most Greeks likely couldn't remember a time before they knew these tales. Many myths were also tied directly to the natural world around them. The changing of the seasons explained through Persephone's yearly journey between the underworld and the surface. The origin of echoes explained through the story of a nymph named Echo. The reason spiders exist explained through the tale of a weaver named Arachne. In this way, the natural world itself became a kind of storybook, every unusual phenomenon carrying its own small, half-remembered legend. There's something gentle in that way of understanding the world. Every strange or unexplained thing wrapped in a story, rather than left cold and unexplained. The whole natural world humming quietly with old, familiar tales passed down like a blanket from one generation to the next. But that is only one small part of the story. Greek city-states developed elaborate systems of law and courts, and ordinary citizens, not professional lawyers, argued their own cases before large juries. In Athens, legal disputes were decided not by a judge in the modern sense, but by juries that could number in the hundreds. Sometimes as many as 500 citizens chosen by lottery, meant to make bribery or intimidation nearly impossible given the sheer number of people involved. There were no professional lawyers to represent you. Each citizen was expected to argue their own case personally before the jury. The wealthier citizens sometimes hired speechwriters to compose persuasive arguments they would then deliver themselves, memorized as though the words were their own. Cases were timed using a water clock, ensuring each side received a strictly equal, measured amount of time to make their argument, regardless of how complicated the matter was. When the water ran out, the speaker had to stop mid-sentence if necessary. Verdicts were reached by simple majority vote, with jurors casting small bronze discs, and there was no possibility of appeal. Whatever the jury decided that day was final. There's something almost startling in that directness. Ordinary citizens, without lawyers or judges standing between them, speaking for themselves, trusting their fate to the collective, careful attention of hundreds of their fellow citizens gathered to listen. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Greek city-states expanded far beyond mainland Greece through a long, patient process of colonization, spreading Greek language and culture across the wider Mediterranean and Black Sea coastlines. Beginning as early as the 8th century BCE, groups of Greek settlers left their home cities to establish new, independent colonies in places like Sicily, southern Italy, the coast of modern Turkey, and along the shores of the Black Sea, often driven by population pressure, land shortages, or political conflict back home. These colonies weren't simply outposts. They became fully independent city-states in their own right, maintaining cultural and religious ties to their founding city, but governing themselves separately, sometimes growing even larger and wealthier than the cities that had founded them. This wide spread of Greek settlements meant that Greek language, architecture, religious practices, and even styles of pottery appeared across an enormous stretch of coastline. From Spain in the west to the edges of the Black Sea in the east, creating a loosely connected web of shared culture stretching thousands of miles. Despite the complete political independence of each individual city, there's something quietly remarkable in that spread small groups of people, setting out in wooden ships toward unfamiliar shores, carrying with them not just supplies, but an entire way of speaking, building, and worshiping, patient seeds of culture scattered gently across a vast and largely unknown sea. But that is only one small part of the story. The ancient Greeks kept animals not only for food and labor, but also, quite tenderly, as household pets and companions. Dogs were by far the most common household animal, valued for hunting, guarding property, and simple companionship. Ancient Greek funerary monuments occasionally include images of beloved dogs alongside their owners, and some inscriptions specifically honor a dog by name, suggesting real, personal affection rather than purely practical use. Cats, less common than dogs, but still present, were valued particularly for controlling mice and other pests around granaries and homes, though they never held quite the same widespread cultural presence in Greece that they did in ancient Egypt. Birds, particularly small songbirds and geese, were also kept, sometimes purely for the pleasure of their company or song, rather than any practical purpose at all. Children, in particular, are shown on surviving pottery playing with small pet animals. A dog chasing a rolling hoop, a bird perched on a child's outstretched finger. Small, ordinary scenes of affection that feel remarkably close to something you might see in any home today. There's something quietly warm in that continuity. The simple, uncomplicated comfort of an animal's company, curled up nearby, present without demanding anything at all. Exactly the kind of quiet presence that might be resting near you himself right now. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Greek festivals were frequent, elaborate, and wove together religious devotion, athletic competition, and genuine, joyful public celebration. The Panathenaic Festival, held annually in Athens, with a much grander version every 4 years, honored the goddess Athena with days of athletic competitions, musical and poetic contests, and a grand procession through the city carrying a newly woven robe called the peplos to dress a sacred statue of the goddess. This procession, depicted in remarkable detail on the frieze of the Parthenon itself, included citizens of every age and status, young girls carrying ritual baskets, elders, cavalry riders, musicians. A genuine cross-section of the city moving together in shared celebration. Beyond this grand festival, the Greek calendar was dotted throughout the year with smaller religious festivals, each honoring different gods with their own particular rituals, foods, and customs. Occasions that broke up the ordinary rhythm of work with shared meals, sacrifices, and genuine communal joy. Moments when the entire structure of daily obligation paused, if only briefly, for something larger and more festive. There's something lovely in imagining that rhythm, ordinary days of labor and worry, interrupted regularly by these bright, communal pauses, whole cities stepping together, if only for a day, into music, procession, and shared celebration. But that is only one small part of the story. Ancient Greek attitudes toward friendship placed enormous, almost sacred value on close bonds between men, considered central to a well-lived life. Philosophers like Aristotle wrote extensively about friendship, distinguishing between shallow friendships based on usefulness or pleasure, and a deeper, rarer kind of friendship based on mutual respect for each other's character. A bond considered essential, in Aristotle's view, to genuine human flourishing, arguably even more central to a good life than romantic love, as it's often emphasized today. Close friendships, particularly among soldiers who fought side by side in the phalanx, or among young men who trained together at the gymnasium and studied together under the same teachers, were often described in ancient texts with a depth of emotional devotion that modern readers sometimes find striking. The story of Achilles and Patroclus in the Iliad, whose profound bond and Achilles' devastating grief at his friend's death, drives much of the poem's emotional weight, reflects just how central these deep same-sex friendships were considered to the Greek understanding of loyalty, honor, and love in its many forms. There's something quietly moving in that old idea that some of the deepest, most meaningful bonds in a life might simply be forged through shared hardship and shared quiet moments, side by side, rather than through any single grand romantic gesture. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Greek houses used remarkably clever, low-technology solutions to manage heat, light, and water long before any modern conveniences existed. Homes were often oriented to make the most of the sun's low winter angle for warmth, while using overhanging roofs or courtyard walls to provide shade during the hotter summer months. An early, intuitive form of what modern architects now call passive solar design. Rainwater was carefully collected from rooftops and channeled into underground cisterns, providing a stored water supply for dry months, while wells supplemented this supply where the local water table allowed. Lighting after dark came from small clay oil lamps, burning the same olive oil used for cooking, their small warm flames casting soft, flickering light across the interior of a home in the evening hours. Cooking took place over simple portable braziers or open hearths rather than dedicated kitchens in the way you might picture them, meaning the smell of a meal, smoke, roasting grain, warmed oil, likely drifted gently through much of the house each evening, rather than being confined to a single room. There's something quietly cozy in that image, small oil lamps flickering low in the evening dark, the whole home lightly scented with the day's cooking, an entire household settling gently into the soft, low light of evening, much like the low, soft light this very moment is settling around you now. But that is only one small part of the story. Greek attitudes toward old age were complicated. Elders were formally respected, yet ancient texts also reveal quiet anxieties about the vulnerabilities that came with aging. Respect for elders was considered a fundamental civic virtue, and in Sparta, especially, older citizens held genuine formal power, serving on councils whose approval was needed for major decisions, their long experience treated as a form of wisdom worth institutionalizing. And yet, Greek literature is also full of more tender, ambivalent reflections on aging. Poets and playwrights wrote about the frustration of a mind that still felt youthful, trapped inside a body growing weaker. The fear of becoming a burden to one's children, the particular sadness of outliving friends, and watching a familiar world slowly change into something less recognizable. Elderly parents, particularly in Athens, had a formal legal right to be cared for by their adult children, a duty taken seriously enough that neglecting an aging parent could actually result in loss of certain citizenship rights. A rare instance of the state directly enforcing what might otherwise seem like a purely private family obligation. There's something quietly tender in that old tension, the same complicated mixture of respect, worry, and love that families still navigate today. Unchanged, it seems, across thousands of years of otherwise vastly different daily life. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Greek attitudes toward the sea were shaped by both deep dependence and deep wariness, since the Mediterranean provided livelihood, but also carried real, constant danger. Fishing communities relied on the sea daily for food, and maritime trade was the lifeblood connecting the scattered, mountainous regions of Greece, difficult to cross by land, into a single, interconnected economic and cultural world. Yet the sea was also genuinely feared, associated with the volatile, unpredictable god Poseidon, and countless votive offerings and prayers survive from sailors and their families, asking for safe passage before a voyage or offering thanks afterward for having returned home safely. Shipwrecks were common enough that they appear frequently in Greek literature and mythology as a kind of ever-present possibility hanging over anyone who depended on the sea. And archaeological surveys of the Mediterranean seafloor have located hundreds of ancient wrecks, their cargo of amphorae, the tall ceramic jars used to transport wine and oil, often remarkably well preserved after thousands of years underwater. There's something quietly moving in imagining those old prayers, murmured at the water's edge before a long voyage. A simple, human hope for safe return, offered up to an unpredictable sea, not so different from any quiet hope you might carry tonight for calm, safe rest. But that is only one small part of the story. Greek attitudes toward beauty extended well beyond the human body, shaping ideas about balance, proportion, and harmony across art, architecture, and even philosophy. The Greeks developed the concept of the golden mean, the belief that ideal beauty and virtue both existed in careful balance between two extremes, an idea reflected physically in the precise mathematical proportions used in designing temples like the Parthenon, where columns, spacing, and even subtle curves in the structure were calculated with extraordinary care to appear perfectly balanced to the human eye. Sculptors similarly developed detailed systems of ideal bodily proportion, treating the human form almost mathematically, believing genuine beauty emerged from careful ratio and balance rather than mere decoration. This pursuit of balance extended into philosophy and ethics as well, with thinkers like Aristotle arguing that virtues themselves existed as a careful middle point between two extremes. Courage, for instance, understood as the balanced midpoint between reckless rashness and cowardly fear, neither too much nor too little of anything. There's something quietly settling in that old idea of balance. Not too much, not too little, just a careful, gentle middle resting point, which is, in its own way, exactly what your body is searching for right now, settling quietly toward its own natural, unhurried balance. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Greek attitudes toward sleep itself were woven quietly into their mythology, treated not as an absence of life, but as a gentle, personified force. Hypnos, the god of sleep, was imagined as a gentle, winged figure, twin brother to Thanatos, the personification of death, a pairing that reflected an old intuition that sleep and death were somehow related, both a kind of surrender, though sleep was the softer, temporary version, one you returned from each morning renewed rather than departed forever. Hypnos was said to live in a quiet, shadowed cave near the underworld, where no rooster crowed and no dog barked, where a gentle stream murmured softly enough to invite drowsiness rather than disturb it, and where poppies grew thickly at the entrance, their seed pods rattling faintly and releasing a comforting, drowsy scent believed capable of inducing sleep in anyone who lingered nearby. From this quiet cave, Hypnos was said to send his son Morpheus, the god associated most closely with dreams, gently into the minds of sleeping mortals to shape the images and stories that unfolded there each night, weaving each person's private, wandering dream just as tenderly as a parent tucking a child gently into bed. There's something quietly beautiful in that old image, an entire imagined cave, hushed and shadowed, existing solely for the purpose of rest, streams murmuring low, poppies releasing their soft scent into still air, existing in the Greek imagination purely to make sleep feel safe, gentle, and cared for. But that is only one small part of the story. Greek attitudes toward the changing seasons were deeply tied to agricultural rhythms, and much of ordinary daily life simply followed the quiet, patient calendar of the land itself. Autumn brought the olive harvest, a labor-intensive task involving entire households working together, often with long wooden poles used to gently knock ripe olives from the branches onto nets spread beneath the trees, followed by pressing the olives into the oil that touched nearly every part of Greek daily life. Winter was the season for pruning vines and olive trees, mending tools and equipment, and weaving cloth indoors during the shorter, colder days, while spring brought planting season and the first table grapes, and summer, the hottest and driest stretch, brought the wheat harvest, cut by hand with curved sickles under a relentless sun. This agricultural rhythm shaped nearly everything else about Greek life. Festivals were often timed to coincide with key points in the farming calendar, giving thanks for a good harvest or asking for rain before planting. And even warfare was seasonal, since most farmer soldiers needed to return home for the harvest, meaning campaigns were typically fought in the gaps between planting and gathering the crops. There's something quietly grounding in that rhythm, an entire civilization organizing its wars, its worship, and its daily labor around the patient, unhurried turning of the seasons, trusting that the land itself, not any human calendar, set the true pace of life. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Ancient Greek attitudes toward the natural world included a genuine, careful curiosity about plants and animals, gathered slowly into some of the earliest surviving works of natural science. The philosopher Aristotle, alongside his broader philosophical work, spent considerable time carefully observing and cataloging the natural world, describing hundreds of species of animals in remarkable, patient detail, their anatomy, behavior, and reproduction, based on direct observation and dissection rather than myth or assumption. He was among the first to attempt a systematic classification of living things, grouping animals by shared characteristics in a way that, while different from modern biological classification, represented a genuinely careful, methodical attempt to understand the patterns underlying the natural world's tremendous variety. His student Theophrastus continued this careful tradition, specifically with plants, describing hundreds of species in what became one of the earliest surviving works of botany, noting details about growth, medicinal use, and cultivation that farmers and gardeners found practically useful for generations afterward. This patient, observational tradition, watching closely, recording carefully, resisting the urge to simply guess or assume, represented a genuinely new way of relating to the natural world, one built on quiet attentiveness rather than myth alone. There's something soothing in imagining that kind of unhurried attention. A person sitting quietly for hours, simply watching, simply noticing, asking nothing more of the world than to be observed closely and understood a little better. Patient study as its own kind of gentle, undemanding companionship with the world. But that is only one small part of the story. Perspective is a strange, gentle thing. Above the streets of ancient Athens, above the fires and the wine and the whispered gossip in the agora, the same sky stretched out that stretches above you now, the same moon moving through its slow, familiar phases, the same stars settling into their unhurried patterns. The people we've wandered through tonight worried about many of the same things you might worry about. Whether their children were safe, whether the harvest would be good, whether they'd said the right thing to a friend, whether tomorrow would be easier than today. They are gone now, all of them, the philosophers in the marketplace, the brides walking by torchlight, the craftsmen shaping clay late into the evening. And yet, something of what they built, what they wondered about, what they wrote down almost by accident on painted pottery, has traveled all the way across nearly 3,000 years to rest quietly in your mind tonight, in this dark, soft room, as you drift toward sleep. There's a kind of gentle comfort in that vast stretch of time, how small your worries from today become, set against such an enormous, patient backdrop. The world has continued turning through every one of humanity's long nights, and it will continue turning gently through this one too. But that is only one small part of the story. There's something quiet worth noticing about your own mind right now. Your mind, in its most basic sense, is simply a prediction machine, constantly guessing what will happen next, constantly comparing the world around you to what it expects, so it can keep you safe and steady. All day, it works quickly, sharply, trying to stay ahead of things. But right now, there's nothing urgent left to predict, nothing left to solve. Just this soft, low voice, moving slowly, asking nothing of you at all. You can let your mind stop reaching forward for a moment. There's no need to guess what comes next in this story, or in tomorrow, or in anything at all right now. Just this quiet unfolding, this slow murmur of an ancient, sunlit world, settling gently now into stillness. You don't need to hold onto any of what we've wandered through tonight. Not the bread and olive oil, not the torchlit weddings, not the philosophers in the marketplace, not the quiet courtyards with their small sacred gardens. You can let all of it soften now into a loose, warm impression, like a half-remembered dream already dissolving at the edges. There's no need to hold it tightly. There never was. Let your body settle a little further into wherever it's resting. Let your breathing continue, slow and unhurried. Each exhale just a little longer and looser than the one before. Let your thoughts, if they're still moving at all, move more like drifting smoke now than anything sharp or urgent, rising, curling, fading softly into the dark. The day is loosening its grip on you now. Whatever it asked of you, whatever it demanded, it can rest now quietly behind you, above you wherever you are. The same sky that stretched over ancient Athens is still turning, slow and steady, the way it always has. It has been unfolding for billions of years, and it will keep unfolding long after tonight, long after tomorrow, patient and unhurried, asking nothing of you at all. You can rest inside that vastness now, small and safe and held. Your body already knows how to rest. Sleep well, and good night.